Okay, thank you. So yeah, I'm Dylan, Executive Director, founder of Caminos de Agua. I'm actually not going to talk about our work today. There's way too much to unpack with this topic, so I'm going to kind of focus on that. I'm actually going to do something, it's a pretty ambitious program I'm going to try to do, so we might have to skip around a bit. I'm going to do something I normally don't do and actually have notes with me and try to stay on topic as much as possible. So I haven't found a way to really unpack this quickly and succinctly. There's just too many things that we need to understand, so I'm going to start with just talking a little bit about the context of water in Mexico today, very briefly, and in our region here, just broad brushstrokes, what's going on. And then from there, I'm going to go into looking at kind of the economic policy, historical events in relation, in Mexico in relation to water over the last century or so. I'm going to try to move through that as quickly as possible. They should be things that some of you or most of you are familiar with, but maybe not so much in the context of water. The goal of that is to get to the National Water Bill that was put forth in 2015, one of the most aggressive privatization bills we've seen anywhere in the world. And then from that, bring it up to about 2 weeks ago when the 10 water decrees were passed by Peña Nieto. While Mexico was celebrating the World Cup win against Germany, they were signing water decrees that were pushing forward the national water bill. So, and if there's time, I want to talk about the other privatization potentially that López Obrador and is not going to be able to remove, but we'll see where we get to. So I'm going to jump into it. Feel free to stop me with questions at any point. This is Mexico today. Most of the water in Mexico, those are all aquifers, is overexploited. So we know it's about 60% of all the groundwater, and groundwater represents about 98% of all the water use in the country, comes from overexploited aquifers, which means we're extracting way more water than we can recharge naturally through rain. So it's dropping the water tables pretty dramatically. On top of that, only about 2% of the rainwater that's actually falling is actually going into the aquifers. Obviously that changes in different parts of the country, but here we're looking around 2% of actual penetration into the aquifers. And it's assumed about 40% of all that water is lost through leaks in the systems. We're going to talk about one of those systems briefly, just to give an idea. And we still have 13 million people without drinking water services, so it's a big challenge. That's Mexico, not going to do any more. Guanajuato today, some of you may know that we focus on that region in northern Guanajuato called the Independence Watershed or the Alto Rio Laja. That's where we do our work, but we're going to talk a little bit more generally about Guanajuato in total. San Miguel is the very bottom part of that orange blob there. So the official numbers are that we're losing about 2 to 4 meters per year in our water table due to over-extraction. That's a deficit that we're looking at about 30%, which means we're taking out 30% more water every year than that can be recharged. So it's going to disappear quickly. And this actually came from a conversation we had with the ex-president of SEPASMA, who told us directly that they assume it's about 60% of all the water in San Miguel de Allende is lost through leaks in the system. So all the roads being torn up, it's actually a good thing. They're repairing the water lines, which are very dated and losing a lot of water, which we don't have the space to really lose. And this is what I usually talk about, but we've got tens of thousands of people exposed to toxic levels of arsenic and fluoride. I would love to talk more about it, but I'm not going to today. So we took these issues with a coalition of dozens of rural communities and grassroots organizations in front of the Permanent Peoples Tribunal in 2013, essentially saying that the contamination of the watershed and the overexploitation was a violation of human rights. They agreed with us, and they basically said that this entire watershed should be declared an emergency zone by the Mexican government. Okay, so there's the context. Now I'm going to take us way back to the Mexican Revolution, 1910, and hopefully move through this quickly. Feel free to stop me at any point. So the big thing that happened, well, we had a revolution in 1910, but what really happened was the Mexican Constitution in 1917, where water was declared along with land a property of the nation. So it was to be held in the hands of the nation, and Private property is a privilege created by the nation, but this was a major, major win. With that, we had Article 27 of the Mexican Constitution, which guarantees the right to land, which essentially takes land and breaks it up from big landowners and creates the ejido system, which is really important to know if you don't. I've got here. Section 7 of that created the ejidos, which are communally owned lands that can be passed down generation to generation, but they cannot be rented or sold. The whole point of that was that there was a very few wealthy landowners that had all of the land in the country, and that this was an attempt to break all that up. And with that, we also started with the expropriation of holdings from all the foreign companies. So it was about 1920 to 1930 is what we have, the revolutionary transition period. And in 1938, we have the expropriation of the oil company, and that essentially put all of the oil resources in Mexico in the hands of the Mexican government, property of the nation. That's why you only see Pemex, not so much anymore. We'll get to that. That's why you only saw Pemex for forever. And we have just major land reforms here, major labor reforms, 8-hour workdays put into place around this time, right to strike, all that good stuff, right? And then we have this major period between 1940 and 1980-ish called import substitution industrialization, also known as the Mexican miracle. This was a moment where Mexico decided after the revolution and after they kind of did the readjustment period of focusing inward and really reducing the foreign dependency and focusing on local production of everything. So during this time, we have actually massive growth in the country. That's why they call it the Mexican miracle in economic circles. We're talking about 4 to 7% growth per year. And during this time, we're seeing massive urbanization as well. Massive move to the urban centers. That's where jobs are being created. The industrial section was growing more rapidly than anything else. But we're also focusing on local agricultural production to offset any sort of imports. And so agriculture is focused internally to produce what is needed for the country. Poverty drops actually substantially, which isn't a big deal because poverty was at like 85% prior to that. But it dropped down to about 50%. But what we don't see usually is that extreme poverty actually drove up to about 10%. It was actually lower than that before. So it was a give and take. But we also saw just a massive increase of population, about doubled during this time, so about 28 million to roughly 70 million or so. And with that, massive urbanization, population doubling, we have an extreme stress on water resources. The cities could not keep up with what was going on, and it's what led to the CUTZAMALA system, for instance. So the CUTZAMALA system, if you haven't heard it, I'm just going to use this as an example quickly. But this system today provides about Mexico City with 20% of its water. During this period, it started in 1942. It's had various phases over the years, but they were struggling. Mexico City was growing unsustainably. They didn't know how to get water to the city. And so what do? Well, they created a series of dams and an intricate network about 150 kilometers away from Mexico City, and they started pumping that water into the city. And that hasn't changed to this day. It keeps growing, actually, the system. The last one was in 1980 something. But they're continuing to grow it. And on top of that, they actually have to pump the water over a mountain. It's a rise of about 1,500 meters, I think, massive rise. And so this is just a huge amount of energy. 1.3 to 1.8 terawatt hours. What's that mean? It means about 1% of all of the energy in the country is needed to pump 20% of Mexico City's water from the CUTZAMALA system. To put it in a different perspective, that's about the same need for Puebla, which is one of the largest cities in the country. I think 3 or 4 million people now. And with this system, we're charging about 3.5 pesos per cubic meter, but the actual cost is about 13.5, so it's completely unsustainable, and this is what's happening throughout the country. And by the way, when we talk about leaks in the system, in the CUTZAMALA system, this is what we're talking about. This is a leak in the system. I mean, millions and millions of liters get lost, and we're talking about 40% loss overall. It's pretty massive. So, I kind of glossed over this stuff, but maquiladoras are the industrial zones that were set up along the border. Most people think that happened at NAFTA. It actually happened well before then in the 60s, and it really started gaining ground under NAFTA. And during that time here in Guanajuato, we had about 2,000 wells in the state, and I'm going to kind of see how that grows over time. And we have the last initial Veda decree. Veda decrees, we're going to talk a lot about that in a minute, but these are essentially restrictions on groundwater extraction. And so, well, it got weird, but okay, 1982, something happens. There's a massive devaluation of the peso. What happened during this time at the end of ISI, import substitution industrialization, is that Mexico was like on an unsustainable spending spree. I mean, they had found oil, and they had lots of money coming in, and they were spending like crazy. And that led up to this point in 1982 with the first peso crisis. The peso crashed. It was they required a massive bailout at the time. I think it was around $5 billion. The World Bank was involved. And that starts deregulation in Mexico, because that kind of bailout comes with strings attached. So it wasn't huge at that time, but that started opening up for deregulatory policies and a little bit of trade liberalization. So Mexico is kind of forced out of this inward focusing growth period, for better or for worse. And then in 1983, here in this region, we had what was called the final Veda decree on water use. That put restrictions on all the water resources in the state of Guanajuato, saying you can't drill a single new well without federal permission. Our aquifers, they knew in 1983 that the aquifers were already overexploited due to the increase in agricultural production, and it's going to grow much more after this. So what happened with that? It had minimal impact. I think, honestly, it would have been much worse if the Vedas hadn't been there. But if you can see that point kind of in the middle, 1983 is where we're saying, okay, we're trying to halt the extraction of groundwater. It's also related to surface water, but we're more interested in groundwater in this region. And we're in that scenario too. I don't know if you can see, but we're actually maybe a little bit higher than that now. This was done in 2000, and we're using way more water than we were before. And we've drilled way more wells. This was, again, illegal. We had maybe 1,500 wells when that Veda decree went into effect. And today we're actually kind of closer to 3,500 just in this watershed. In the state as a whole, we've got a lot more. But I'm going to kind of jump back and forth. Sorry if that's confusing. But so getting back to it, so that's where we're at here in this region. 1983, we got 1,500 wells. We've grown massively. Just 10 years prior, we only had about 500 or 600. 1985, there's a huge earthquake in Mexico City. I'm sure many of you know about that, and that really rocked the water systems. The CUTZAMALA system. There was thousands of breaks in the line. There's like 60 major breaks, and it just really impacted the system. And they think that there was about 40% loss of all the water pumped in the city, not from the pumping during that time. So it was something. 1987, we get into the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. That was kind of the first big neoliberal policy that was forced onto Mexico. Well, I guess that's my perspective, but which started to open up for privatization of like transport, the ports, things like that. And it's going to have implications for us in water as well. But trying to get through this, so I'm just going to jump forward to NAFTA. The symbol and substance of neoliberalism, as one of my favorite authors put it. NAFTA is economic policy disguised as a trade agreement. It's 1,000 pages or more if you've ever looked at it, and it talks a lot more than just about trade. So, what happens under NAFTA? Oh, this is, Alana Solomon saying that we need to stop negotiating trade pacts for the protections of our air, water, land workers are being impacted. So This forces Mexico really into a different situation of really focusing on export, specifically with water. So we start doing really unsustainable water use in the support of export-oriented agriculture. Our virtual water exports increase a lot. Our water imports also increase. And we actually see other things impacted, like the environmental concerns with water. The maquiladoras along the border saw upwards of a 30% increase in the contamination. We start using massive pesticides, herbicides for all this need for export agriculture, and our water use skyrockets due to the export agriculture that we start doing during this time. 1997, the corn safeguards were eliminated. So given that corn, Mexico is the birthplace of corn, founded here about 9,000 years ago. And now we import corn. This was always known under NAFTA, that we knew that this was going to happen, likely. But corn was given a very special status. It was given 15 years of protections under the subsidies, and the Mexican government decided to get rid of them after 2 or 3 years. Just because it was an unfair barrier to trade, right? Okay. I'm going to skip some of this stuff here. But yeah, environmental inspections dropped substantially, about 45% after NAFTA. And so during this time, we're extracting just massive amounts of the water. The Vedas obviously aren't working. And so Mexican government decides to form these things called COTAs, the Technical Water and Sanitation Councils in Mexico, or the Technical Water Councils. They're really dealing with groundwater, the technical groundwater, agua subterránea, technical groundwater councils. And so these are placed all throughout Mexico in every sub-watershed. So we have one in every sub-watershed here. We've got 2 for our region. And they're essentially put into place to make sure that people aren't extracting more water than their concessions. The problem is that they're given absolutely no power to do so. They're technically they're independent, but they're funded by the government, and they each have 1 engineer and 1 helper, and they're supposed to deal with thousands of wells or hundreds of wells, depending on which one. And they have absolutely no power to actually fine people for going over their concessions, or really any sort of power to do anything about it. So the COTAs are there. They exist specifically to deal with groundwater, and they're very, very ineffective. And it's not their fault. 2008, we look at about 2.3 million net job loss under NAFTA since 1994. We saw actually a big growth in the north, but we had a massive migration of agriculture, about 5 million jobs lost there, because essentially Mexican farmers were put into direct competition with highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness overnight. By the way, U.S. agribusiness is still subsidized, but Mexican agribusiness is not. So now we get to 2012. I put February 8th there because it's my birthday, and that was when Mexico declared that water is a human right. They made actually an amendment to the Mexican Constitution. It took us all by surprise. It was a very exciting thing, that everyone has a right to access and be provided water and drainage for personal and domestic consumption. So personal and domestic consumption in a sufficient, safe, acceptable, and affordable manner. The state shall guarantee this right. And this was a big deal for people working in water. This was years and years and years of work of trying to get this change made to the Mexican Constitution, Article 4. And it establishes, on top of that, citizen participation, which is really big. And so this needs to be in any water bill. Any water bill needs to have the focus of water as a human right if it's going to be passed. And it needs a combination of citizen participation with the 3 levels of government. This is in the Constitution. Just keep that in mind. So we get Peña Nieto, 2013. I don't know if it was a surprise to me. Maybe I'm just naive, but he successfully worked for the privatization of the oil company. Not a lot of movement's been on that, because really what that was a guise to do was to really, yes, oil, but more technical oil that Mexico doesn't have the expertise to deal with, like fracking, risky offshore oil drilling, where the US really has the technology to do that. Not much has happened because you can't do fracking without water. And that's really where they were trying to go with this, is that they needed they needed oil open for privatization, and they need to deal with the water at the same time, because these guys aren't going to come down and do their work if they don't have a guarantee of the water that they need, which is millions upon millions of liters. I'm not an expert in fracking, but as I understand it, we have to do the fracking in the north. It's complicated horizontal shale something, which requires substantially more water than traditional fracking on top of that. So in 2015, we come to the national water law was proposed. It had been sitting around for some time, but the point of this was quite specifically to deal with water privatization. It really was kind of, it wasn't hidden, let's say. So it's been known as several things: the General Water Law, the Kornfeld Law. Kornfeld was the ex-director of SEPASMA, of Conagua, the national water company that got pushed out due to corruption and scandal, as happens so often here. And so now we call it the Charla Law. I don't want to go into all of it, but it is really important to understand this if we're going to talk about like where we're at today, because it's all based on what they're trying to do with this bill. Sorry, there's so many words. I usually don't have words, but I'm going to try to pull out certain sections here that are interesting. So one was this idea of creating water banks, which essentially gives the federal authority over large swaths of water concessions to give out as they see fit for the good of the people. And it also, with that same section, we see that the ejidatarios, the ejidos, would actually have to give up their water rights if they rented their land. They knew that they had to have water as a human right in there because of the Mexican Constitution. So what they struggled to define that as is that the obligation of the government would be to guarantee 50 liters per day. That's the guarantee per person, but that's the guarantee for water as a human right. Okay, you can do some things with that, I guess. And again, it was pretty blatant, to be honest, of this idea of having water available to industrial uses like fracking. They redefined, this actually came out of the energy reform, but they redefined industrial use as the, oh, I'm getting ahead of myself, sorry. This is about privatization of water and sanitation systems and municipal systems, which was a big part of it, was pushing that into private. This is what I was talking about, though, is that industrial use was changed to the use of water for extraction of any substance in the subsoil, or subsoil. Sorry, and it actually wouldn't require any sort of concession for mining use. It was an exception. This is a representative from a big oil company. He was the African representative. This is one thing he said, which just kind of struck me. During this time, they were very excited. They called Mexico a sweet shop for the oil business. We have onshore, offshore, unconventional, high-risk opportunities. They were really looking forward to being able to exploit the oil privatization. We all good? Okay. What else do we have in there? So, impunity to polluters. So the state was to promote voluntary participation. This is actually in there in the auditing of evaluation themes of the water sector for compliance and regulation. Voluntary, awesome. And avoid the responsibility for the, this is a great one, for the actual quality of the drinking water. So we're dealing here in our region, arsenic fluoride, but arsenic fluoride, lead, all these things are major issues throughout the country. They're really, really affecting lots of regions throughout the country. And what we see here is that it gives the providers themselves, the private providers, the possibility of certifying themselves on matters of water quality. Again, that's in there. They had a complete disengagement when talking about disasters. For us, this is a big deal, thinking about what happened last year in Mexico City, especially with water. I mean, there's major water issues. And they're saying basically to guarantee your human right, you really need to take care of it yourself. Self-care, self-protection. That's how you deal with disasters, is that you prepare for them. And yeah, so you should take the proper measures to reduce the damages to your own person, property, and environment. Okay, great. It keeps going deeper. This one I show because it really has a major impact on us. This is talking about prohibiting the actual study of what's happening with water in the country. So if we don't get permission from the National Water Company, we can no longer test rural drinking wells. And we can actually really implement projects because it does have there's something in there about actual remediation programs not being allowed to move forward without federal permission from CONAGUA, the National Water Commission. And the penalty is upwards of 50,000 days of minimum wage. So this is a big deal, not just for us, but for like the UNAM. Researchers in the country and external who come here and are doing research on watersheds, on water use, all of that would become illegal if they did not get federal permission. Luckily, 2015, there's a major backlash. Whether you saw it or not, it was huge. We work in water, so we paid attention, and it was big. Tens of thousands of people were marching on Mexico City. It started this movement called Agua para Todos, Agua para la Vida, which exists to this day, and they're really the forerunners. If you get a chance, I recommend you go to their page, aguaparatodos.org.max. Sorry, I can't switch languages apparently. And they really rallied groups around the country to push against the bill. We did here, we worked with dozens of communities throughout the region, dozens of organizations, had a big come out on World Water Day in 2015. Where essentially we trucked people from all the communities and we just were educating them on the water bill, what was happening and what we need to do. And ultimately it failed. They couldn't get it passed. The outcry was just too massive and it was done, sort of. It didn't actually get pulled off the table. They just never held a vote on it. It just kind of sat there. So, 2017, we get into Guanajuato. The water bill has been sitting there. Peña Nieto's still hanging around. They start pushing for state laws to look at privatization because they can't do it on the national level. And they start doing a whole lot with that. In our region, we're up to about 3,500 wells now. Again, when that last Veda decree went in that said we can't drill any wells, we were at 1,500. Today we're at 3,500. Statewide, we're at about 18,000. Those are registered wells. There's lots of unregistered wells too. And where's this water going? Anybody?
Export ag.
Yeah, it's going to the US in the form of water-intensive hortalizas, crops. Guanajuato is like the second or third, it keeps changing, largest exporter of broccoli in the world, just the state of Guanajuato. We see just during this time, irrigated agribusiness skyrockets. I mean, between the final Veda decree and then after NAFTA, it just shoots up. And on top of that, because of how water politics work in Mexico, it's incredibly inefficient on top of it. A colleague of ours, a researcher out of Wageningen University in the Netherlands, is going to be publishing a paper this year, I hope. I say it every year, but he's going to get around to it at some point. He's looking at water use in broccoli production in Guanajuato, specifically in this region. The average is somewhere around 285 liters per kilo of broccoli. He was finding here very consistently upwards of 1,500 liters per kilo of broccoli, 5 times the amount that's actually necessary. Why? Okay, so we've got 3,500 wells in our region, 18,000 in the state. Now, because of water's special place as both considered a human right, but actually because it's still considered part of the nation, there's specific safeguards for agricultural use, which means that agriculture producers don't pay for the water use. They just pay for the electricity to pump the water. Okay, there was a reason for that at one point. It's been exploited since then. But because of that, with 20,000, 25,000 wells in the state, we're probably around there, most of those are used for agriculture, but there's not a real incentive to inspect those wells because they're not paying for it. So CONAGUA, the National Water Authority, is the only agency that can actually fine water users for going over their concessions, and they need to get paid. None of these agencies have money, and industrial users pay for their water use. It's a different classification. So Conagua is spending most of their time dealing with industrial users and not really focused in on the agricultural producers because it doesn't pay the bill. On top of that, does anyone want to guess how many inspectors today we have that can actually inspect those wells and fine people for going over their water use?
A dozen.
Yeah, that's pretty good, 10. We have 10 inspectors for about 25,000 wells that are supposed to be inspected every year. Okay, it's literally impossible. One of the analyses that our colleague did said that it would take about 44 years just to do one inspection one time on every single well if they worked, efficiently. So I'm going to take us into San Miguel really quick just to see what that looks like. So here in San Miguel, I don't know if you can read this, but we've got about 680 wells in the municipality. This is 2015, so we're probably above that. And if you really look into there, you can see that we're at almost 93% for agricultural use. So there's really not a whole lot our personal consumption is going to do to change anything, right? We really need to change how water is used in this country if we're going to make an impact. I don't like to put so many words on here, but I just love this quote. It comes from a paper where he was just talking about, our colleague from the Netherlands was talking to an ex-Conagua inspector and got him to talk about how it actually works that you can drill wells illegally but get them registered because they're actually in the registry. And he said, oh, well, you do this, you drill a new well, you set the paperwork in motion, you contact Conagua, they come out, they send an inspector, you spill some oil around, you take some pictures, you pay a bribe, they certify it as the well is with antiquity to say that, oh, we just missed it. Yeah, this well was here, 1965, looks like, great, and that's all you need to do. And this was actually an ex-Conagua inspector talking about how he supplemented his own income. So, the broccoli economy. This is my favorite graph of all time. I can't take any credit. This is one of my colleagues, Aaron Krupp, who did some research on Mexican broccoli production. Broccoli is not a Mexican food. We produce a lot of broccoli here, but I've never had enchiladas de broccoli. It's not a common food. And it's really interesting when you look at this, because from 1960 to around 1980, when Mexico was in that period of inward focusing, import substitution, industrialization, where they're focusing inwardly, there's zero broccoli production, because it's not a Mexican food. They're focusing internally. We don't need it. But then we hit 1982 and we get that drop, right? That first peso crisis comes in and really hits things hard, and Mexico kind of has to start deregulating a little bit, start looking at export, agriculture and things like that. And then we start seeing it go up pretty massively, actually. And that's kind of during this period right before NAFTA. Here comes NAFTA right there. And actually in 1995, there's another devaluation of the peso, a huge crisis, really impacted the country. And you can actually see there, right after that, it kind of drops. Because the country is in a really bad economic situation. But then from there, there's a second peso crisis, and then we kind of get the complete integration into neoliberal policy. And I just think it's really fascinating to look at the economic impact of water use through the form of broccoli production in Mexico during that time. Okay, so that's where we're at last year. Where are we at just a couple weeks ago? So, has anybody heard of the water decrees? Okay, couple. I see some that work with me, so. Okay. So seriously, I was going to Mexico City Airport, and my colleague Paco sends me an article that says Mexico's privatizing 55% of the water resources, and Mexico's playing at the same time Germany in the World Cup. I'm like, what's going on here? And then, Germany scores a goal, and another article comes in. I'm like, what is going on here? And then Mexico wins, and this gets totally buried. Enrique Peña Nieto signed 10 water decrees during this time. It's not uncommon to try to push that through, especially during an election cycle, and especially when you're trying to get these things done. World Cup is great cover. So what they put into place is what's called the Water Reserves Program. This is in place now. And during that time between 2015 and today, when they couldn't get the water bill passed, I decided I just don't even look at my notes. I don't know what the point is, but the Mexican government, specifically Conagua, is working with the World Wildlife Fund, one of the most well-respected independent conservation organizations in the world. It's a really smart way to do this. And then they get in also the Rio Ronte Foundation, which is one of the the biggest funders of water projects, private foundation in Latin America. And they come up with the Water Reserves Program to protect watersheds. And at the same time, I'm seeing this. Enrique Peña Nieto just signed a bill to privatize 55% of all the surface water in the country. Or this. The government's gonna concession water from 300 different watersheds for 50 years to private companies. Okay. So there's a lot to unpack here. It's not necessarily one or the other, but we still don't have a whole lot of information, but this is kind of what we know right now. There's about 300 watersheds in the country that are under this new Water Reserves Program to create water reserves. It sounds great on its face. And these 300, it's 300 about 757, I think, if I'm getting that right. Yep. Are in 20 different states. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought there. But yeah, so they're meant to set up water reserves to protect water resources in these 300 these 300 watersheds. So what do we really know? So there's lots of information coming from both sides. You've got World Wildlife Fund saying a lot of things, how great this is, okay. You've got obviously the Mexican government that says this is absolutely not privatization. You've got other people saying that it is. So what's going on? I mean, all I can say is that this president has fought ferociously to privatize water resources in this country. When that didn't work, he really pushed states to do private privatization of their water systems in municipalities and in different states. And this is what they've been trying to do. That's the facts. Then they signed these water decrees, which look on their face very different. But this is a president who fought ferociously and won to privatize the Mexican oil company. They started looking for water after that. And I don't know what else to say except that's that. And these new decrees absolutely allow for the exploitation of water resources in areas that it was once prohibited. That's a fact. It does. It does put lots of other things in place, but that's kind of where we're at. So I'm going to kind of break it down just a little bit. Here's what World Wildlife Fund says. Like, okay, 70% of the water on average through these different watersheds is protected by the environment. Great. We're going to reserve 1% for population growth to make sure that we're good by 2070. I think it's okay. I mean, the population is going to go up. We're going to reserve some water for population growth. Okay. But 29% is now available to be concessioned. And these are in areas that had Veda decrees where that was not allowed. So this is now allowed by law that about 30%, we're going to save 70%, but 30% of that is now up for grabs.
Dylan, can that be sold to American companies?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so like the Coke company is going to buy that.
Yeah, we'll get to that right now. So what these reserve zones do is that they guarantee the specific volume for what they call urban public or environmental use. Urban public is an interesting classification, but I won't go too deep into that. But it frees up the rest, that 30% or so on average, again. Others have more, others have less. But for any use, which includes industrial use, if the authorities think that, consider it to be for public utility. This is very explicit. What is industrial use again? Water for any product that one can extract from the subsoil by any process. I feel like that's the definition of fracking to me, but I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on that. So what these water decrees do is that they remove the Vedas, which again are on the entire country, but they remove them in these 300 watersheds, which again represent over 50% of the nation's water resources. So what does that mean? It means that, these Vedas were constantly violated over the past 30 years. We just saw that in our own region, constantly. But multinational companies need a guarantee for the water concessions. The way that the Vedas have been exploited in this region are very different. We have mid-scale agricultural producers that have exclusive contracts with multinational companies. Multinational companies don't need a water concession. They work with these producers. These producers don't work, they go to a different producer, fine. If we want to do fracking, we want to do oil exploration, things like that, the companies need a guarantee. And these water decrees allow them to get that water concession guaranteed. What about the citizen participation? I didn't hear anything about this. Nobody else seemed to hear about anything about this. That goes against the Mexican Constitution, Article 4. 2012, we changed the Mexican Constitution, requires citizen participation. We don't know what citizens were participating in this, but I guess World Wildlife Fund, I don't know. But that the participation with the 3 levels of government needs to be there to make sure that we have the equitable, sustainable access and use for water. Because of that, NGOs in Chiapas that were really affected by this, they just rejected the decrees like I think 2 days ago. Again, this is all super new information that we're just kind of processing. But saying that that no one talked to them. No one talked to their water committees, their water councils. They had no information about this. They had no information to review this. And so that affects 69 watersheds and they're going to fight it. Expired concessions. So the decrees extinguish the water rights for concessions that were not renewed in time. What does that mean? We're not sure, but it says this in, all the decrees have this language in there, where it says that the concessions or assignments are granted, sorry, that's a mistranslation, but we'll recognize those water rights as long as the title has not expired. Now, a bunch of stuff happened before where ejidatarios and things like that didn't have to renew anything. So most of these people don't think that they have anything to renew. And an analysis that was actually done by Agua para Todos found that they think there's about 50,000 expired concessions right now on the table. And again, mostly held by ejidos and rural communities, and who never thought that they would actually have to renew their water rights. So who can that go to? Well, first come, first serve. It states very explicitly in one of the decrees that inspired accessions can be assigned to the first person who presents the request. Cool. So what's going to happen? CONAGUA will likely take possession of these expired concessions and release them. I think they're going to release them to mining and oil companies. I think that's legitimate. So what about the human right to water? Again, Mexican Constitution was amended in 2012. Any water bill has to be focused on the human right to water. There is no verbiage in here about the human right to water. It's kind of been bastardized a little bit to talk about urban public use as some sort of equivalent to the human right to water. It doesn't say it in there, but that's one of the arguments we've seen. I'm not sure what that means, but it doesn't sound like a human right to water to me. Oh yeah, and of course, urban public use does include any use to which a state or municipal agency would like to concession or contract its waters. Okay. So we're seeing this out throughout the country that you give states that authority, well, they start to do things like favor bottling companies. We see that in Mexicali. They start favoring industry, obviously in Querétaro, massive use for water in industry now, and even mining and fracking very blatantly. This hasn't gone through yet, but the Panuco in Nuevo León is looking very explicitly at using water for fracking up in the north where there's lots of shale. And again, we kind of touched on this, but it's really trying to move national waters to state waters. Role of governors in water management since 2015 has skyrocketed. It's what the government's been pushing, and it really produces large allocations for this public urban use to go to the state governments, giving them 50 years, and it lays the groundwork for privatization because they're now able to transfer those concessions on a state level. And talking about transfers, who can you transfer it to? Well, you can transfer it to CFE and Pemex, no problem. They're considered, what's the word? Yeah, any public entity, right? This is just a weird one, but for the environmental part, you can use that to concession downstream, which is just kind of weird if you're looking at actual watershed rehabilitation. Why are you going to focus everything downstream? And this is just an odd one that I pulled out, but every decree has this language in here saying that we should really focus the maximum use of water for economic development. So I don't know what happened to the human right to water, but it seems like economic development is the major pusher of this. How they're able to push it through is beyond me. I'm not a lawyer, I don't know. But again, I think, and others agree that this is in contrast to the provision Article 4 in the Mexican Constitution. So, what about AMLO? The new president, he's gonna get rid of everything, right? He said he would. Great. We have until November 30th before anything can happen. They pushed this through really quickly, really slyly. They spent a lot of time working on it with multinational NGOs, and this is the time right now. This is the time where they've got up until November 30th to concession that water out with 50-year rights before AMLO comes in and can do anything about it, right? Is that reversible? I don't really know, to be honest. I'm trying to process all this information, but we do know that likely they wouldn't push that through if that isn't a possibility, and so it's going to be an interesting few months for water rights in Mexico, I think. So real briefly, I just want to talk about the other privatization, which is just bottled water. This is something that we don't really think about here in the country that much, but Mexico is the biggest consumer per capita of bottled water in the world. The second two are the United States and Spain, which is beyond me because they have potable water coming out of their taps, but okay. But Mexico is far and beyond the highest, 234 liters per year. That's like $1,800 a year that they're spending on bottled water, most of it coming from companies like Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, etc. And we're talking about 26 billion liters a year. 70% comes in the form of the garrafones, the big 20-liter jugs, and 30% in the bottles. And with that, we're creating a lot of trash. So what does that mean for actual cost of water? So in the municipal city, we're paying about 0.1 pesos per liter. It's a little bit dated. But the municipal level, this is piped water, we're seeing up to 3.6 pesos per liter. 36 times as expensive. This is the case of one community called Llano Verde. They have 70 families. We spent a lot of time working with them. We did a lot of work with them. They're all paying about 40 to 90 pesos a month for their water bill. I don't know what your water bill is, but mine is kind of close to 90 pesos a month. And that's the one tap that they have for the 17 families that's shared between everybody. And they get, on average, 5 liters per person per month through that tap. But they're paying 40 to 90 pesos per month for that water. We asked them why they keep paying, because they're on a network, and they're like, well, we hope one day the water will come, and we don't want to, get behind on our bills. So they keep paying. The water's not coming, and we've tried, to express that. I mean, they have to drill the well deeper if the water's actually going to come, because it's just not going to reach them. So this is the reality in the rural sectors. We also have things called pipas, which is trucking water in and filling up giant cisterns. We see it all over the region, all over Mexico, but especially here in the rural communities. And that's still about 3 times as expensive as what you would pay in the city. That other one is subsidized by the government if it's at that cost. But the bottled water, I'm not even going to touch the small bottled water. The big bottled water that most people drink here is like 20 times as expensive on a good day. This is dated. I mean, we're talking, in rural communities upwards of 35 pesos. And they did an analysis and seeing about like 35 to 40% of all of the water spending is actually on bottled water. So we talk a lot about water rights and things like that, but we don't realize like where we're actually spending our money on water is, 35 to 40% is going to buying bottled water. And on top of that, with regulations and everything, we can't guarantee it. I can't remember what year, this is 2015, when the health secretary had to shut down 192 purification plants in Mexico City because they didn't comply with real basic water norms of literally just bacteria and pathogens. The most basic you would expect them to comply with. And that was like out of 488, so I can't do the math off my top of my head, but it's a good percentage that they were literally just shut down in Mexico City because they couldn't comply. And obviously on top of that, we have this massive waste problem with the billions of bottles of water we're drinking every year. I think I've gone way over. So I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to just keep it down, and we can open up for questions or discussion or anything.
Okay.